Alan appeared in Fairmont Crest on an afternoon that seemed perfectly ordinary, when luxury cars still rolled quietly through the security gates and the meticulously trimmed lawns still reflected a soft, velvet green under the pale sunlight. But his figure, thinner, dried out, worn down as if time itself had been grinding him away, carried something that was anything but ordinary. A secret stretching back decades, powerful enough to turn everything this community relied on for its sense of stability and prestige into ashes. He walked like someone who had once belonged to this place and had then been pushed out to the margins of the world, now returning not to beg for a place at the table, but to reclaim a piece of the truth that had been buried alive with the passing years. On the road leading up to the Dupree residence, memories crashed over him like waves. Closed-door meetings, thick envelopes, promises whispered in the dim corners of a hospital long ago, where a newborn had been lifted out of the crib that should have been theirs and delivered into the arms of complete strangers. Alan had always known he was complicit. He had always understood that he was not only a victim of the system, but also one of its tools. Yet only when old age, illness, and loneliness knotted him did he finally realize that this secret had not only stolen his child from him, but had also created a chain of lies binding all those who seemed to be the strongest figures in Fairmont Crest into a shared web of guilt. Elsewhere in the same community, Eva was still moving along the trajectory everyone around her believed she had chosen. A life prepositioned between power, wealth, and the constant pressure to prove her worth in a family where every gaze carried calculation. She had grown used to being seen as just a piece in someone else's strategy, a pawn people were always trying to maneuver into the most advantageous square on Fairmont Crest's chessboard. But that day, before Alan appeared, she could still believe that at least her origins were clear, that the name on her birth certificate, on her medical records, on the documents of the funds tied to her, was the truth. She had no idea her life was standing closer to the edge than anyone else's, that a single sentence from some faded, almost anonymous old man could send everything she used to define herself plunging into the same kind of abyss that ringed the forest behind Fairmont Crest. Meanwhile, Alan held on to every detail about the child he had been forced to give up, its birth weight, its first cry, the name he had once wanted to give but had been brushed aside by those with more power, and all the years afterward when it grew up among people who were never truly its own, in a house where every framed photograph on the wall served as a reminder that it was only part of a story constructed to look good, not to be true. Alan's decision to return to Fairmont Crest did not come in a sudden rush of emotion. It was distilled from countless sleepless nights in a shabby apartment, staring at stacks of old files yellowed with age. He knew exactly which signatures he had placed not out of medical ethics, but out of fear, debt, and a secret payment he once accepted to ensure that a child would never know who it really was. There were copies of hospital records with the birth mother's name erased, accounting sheets from supposedly charitable medical funds where mysterious, unassigned expenses suddenly appeared, and transfer slips documenting money quietly siphoned from what was meant to be a clean community trust. All of it piled up into living proof that Fairmont Crest had never been just a peaceful enclave for the wealthy, but a carefully built stage designed to hide a cruel pact among its richest players. Alan had tried to look away, had tried to convince himself that the past was over, that the child had grown up and built a life of its own, that speaking up now would only make everything worse. But the illness in his body, along with the slow fading of those who had once sworn that oath with him, forced him to acknowledge one truth: if he stayed silent until he died, the only person left to live with the full consequences of this secret would be Eva. A woman who had never been asked for her consent when her life was placed on the table as a bargaining chip. When Alan stepped across the invisible line dividing the safe and sensitive zones of Fairmont Crest to approach Eva, he knew he was putting a match to a fuel tank that had been accumulating beneath the community's reinforced concrete for far too long. The moment he revealed that he was, in fact, Eva's biological father, the atmosphere that had seemed so solid shattered like cracking glass. But the truth he brought was not just a story about bloodlines, it dragged behind it a whole chain of consequences: the swapping of hospital records in their youth, a sum of money that had once been quietly funneled out of a residence protection fund, and a vicious oath signed by people far more powerful than Eva had ever imagined. Because if Eva was not the child born into the family everyone believed she belonged to, that meant someone had once decided they did not want her to exist in the official currents of power. Had she once been a direct threat to the position or assets of a key figure in the Dupree family, so much so that they were willing to pay, to deceive, to rearrange medical records so she could be raised somewhere else, in another role entirely? And if so, was that person still sitting at the very top of this community now, watching everything unfold like an unexpected earthquake they had long believed their foundations could withstand? In the first days after the news quietly spread, Fairmont Crest seemed to hold its breath. The club corridors, the gym, the brunches, the residence council meetings, all of it continued as scheduled, but beneath the surface of politeness and ceremony, an undercurrent was racing everywhere. Eva became the focal point of a new kind of gaze, no longer just envy, admiration, or the casual curiosity reserved for those born into powerful families, but a blend of confusion and fear. People suddenly recalled small details they had once overlooked. The times Eva looked nothing like anyone else in the house, the stray, distant look in her eyes at ceremonies where she was supposed to feel at home, the occasions when financial documents tied to her name appeared and then vanished without a trace. Had someone known, or at least suspected, and chosen silence because they feared the chain of power would collapse and crush them too? Had a few of the older faces in Fairmont Crest crossed paths with Alan years ago, in discreet meetings, envelopes tucked into briefcases, gentle yet razor-sharp warnings, and then spent the years since living in constant dread that one day the past would come knocking? For Eva, the information that Alan was her biological father was not just a slap to her ego, it was the dismantling of the entire psychological architecture she had used to survive. Family dinners, gatherings, compliments, responsibilities, expectations, all of it suddenly lost its anchor. She began to re-examine every moment of her childhood with new eyes, the times she was left out of major decisions, the occasions when her name was left off provisional inheritance lists only to be added back later like a gesture of appeasement, the strange looks adults exchanged when someone mentioned the day she was born. Had there always been a strange atmosphere clinging to her name that she had grown too used to notice? Alan's arrival pushed all these questions to a new level, forcing her to confront the possibility that people had not only hidden the truth about her origins, but might also have used her very identity as a bargaining chip in a power struggle that had been going on for years. Alan, meanwhile, did not have the luxury of seeing himself as a pure victim in this story. In those moments when he stood quietly at a distance, watching Eva after revealing the truth, his mind kept circling back to that night of signatures long ago. Back then, he had been a young doctor, ambitious but foolish, entangled in debts and reckless financial decisions. A gambling debt, a wealthy patient, an offer too tempting to refuse. In exchange for altering the file of a difficult birth, he would receive enough money to salvage his career, his family, and his reputation. He had hesitated, had wrestled with his conscience, but in the end he signed. In that moment, he did not just sell his professional ethics, he sold away his right to be openly recognized as a father. He knew he was the one who allowed others to decide the fate of the child who shared his blood, knew that the cry that night should have been the beginning of a new chapter in his life, not a sound drowned out by the slam of a hospital door and the rustle of an envelope. Now, looking back, he had to ask himself, was revealing the truth truly an act of redemption, or merely a late attempt to spread the weight of his guilt onto others, to force the entire community to share a burden he had carried alone for too long? Behind the scenes of Fairmont Crest, the story did not end with a biological secret. There was another, deeper layer, something Alan mentioned to Eva only in fragments, just enough to keep her awake at night. A secret fund created years earlier, ostensibly to protect the community and support residents in hardship, but in reality serving as a shared wallet for the political and economic schemes of a small group. This fund included nameless disbursements, hard-to-trace transactions, transfers that coincided suspiciously with controversial decisions made by the Residence Council. And the cruel irony was this: part of the fund's legal framework was tied to a newborn child. The child who would later be known as Eva. Vague clauses about a symbolic heir of a generation holding final signature rights to activate or neutralize certain tranches of assets made her very existence and true identity a matter of survival for more than a few people. If Eva was not the child the documents claimed she was, then who truly held the legal right? And now that she knew the truth, did that turn her into a mortal threat to those who had been exploiting the fund in the shadows? As Eva began to follow the trail Alan had left, she found thick layers of dust over the archive shelves of the old hospital, files and former law offices that once handled the community fund, and old photos from inauguration ceremonies and fundraisers where the faces of people still standing atop Fairmont Crest's power structure appeared again and again. Every document she read seemed to remove another brick from the wall that had been built around her all her life. Familiar names emerged in the lists of founders, supervisors, and signatories of the medical records from that year, forcing her to face a terrifying truth: this had not been the plot of a lone individual, but the result of a collective pact. Among those who had claimed to protect her, how many had really been protecting themselves from the truth? Among those who now feigned shock at Alan's confession, how many had met him before in quiet meetings? How many pairs of eyes had slid past him in that hospital parking lot years ago and deliberately looked away as if they had never seen him? The conflict inside Eva grew more intense with each passing day. Part of her longed to believe in Alan, to accept him as a father who had been stripped of his right to be a father and was now trying to make up for the years he had lost. That part recognized, in his eyes, not only guilt, but also the pain of a man pushed out of his own life story. But another part screamed in outrage at the sense of betrayal. Where had he been when she was crushed under the unreasonable demands of her adoptive family? Where had he been when she felt adrift at glittering parties, while major decisions about her future were made in rooms she was never invited into? Where had he been when her name was used to sign documents she now suspected were more about money and power than the good of the community? Could she really stand beside someone who had stayed silent for so long, even if he was now bringing her the truth she had always craved? Or would she choose to stand against him, see him as just another cog in the machine that had deceived her, and demand that he be held accountable like everyone else? Fairmont Crest, meanwhile, continued to spin as if nothing had happened. Parties were still thrown, meetings still held, press releases about charitable contributions and community projects still appeared regularly in the internal bulletin. But the perceptive could spot the hairline fractures spreading across the surface. Handshakes just a fraction colder than usual, eyes that darted away when someone mentioned the early years of the fund, late-night phone calls among core council members, unfamiliar cars coming and going from the old hospital building where the paper records were kept. They all knew the truth Alan had hurled into their midst could never be shoved back into a broken box. The question was no longer whether it could be concealed, but who would be chosen as the sacrificial scapegoat, who would manage to keep their seat, and who would lose everything if Eva decided to follow this story to its bitter end? Amid all this, Eva suddenly understood that she was not just the victim of a swapped identity, but the center of a new war. She could choose to step back, accept a softer version of the truth, push Alan into a dark corner of her memory, and allow things to settle back into their old stability. Or she could use the truth of her origins like a blade, cutting through the network of lies that had bound her all her life, knowing that when the blade fell, the blood spilled would not only belong to those who had wronged her, but might also belong to people she had once loved. She asked herself, if she moved forward, flung open the doors to the secret fund, laid her hand on the numbers others had hidden with blood and tears, would Fairmont Crest collapse or be reborn? And if this community were forced to stare into the cracked mirror Alan had raised, would they choose to repair it or smash it further, sacrificing her yet again to preserve their illusion of safety? In that charged silence, Alan continued to wait not for forgiveness, but for a decision. He knew his return had opened a path whose end he could not see. Tomorrow he might very well become the sacrificial offering for the entire system, blamed for every wrong, painted as the sole culprit. Or perhaps, somehow, Eva would use what he had brought her to rewrite her own fate. But he also knew that once a truth is dragged out of the dark, it will never willingly go back. And Fairmont Crest, whether it liked it or not, would have to learn how to exist in a world where the babies switched long ago had grown up, found their voices, and begun to ask questions. Had any of the community's most powerful members ever truly prepared an answer, or had they simply trusted that the past would stay buried with weak men like Alan until the day those very men returned, wearing the faces of the secrets they had once tried so hard to erase? Thank you all for your loyal support and listening.